The desert doesn't make noise. Not really. You get the wind, sure. A coyote now and then. But mostly the sound out here is the sound of nothing. A deep, heavy silence that presses in on you, gets inside your bones. A silence that lets you hear your own heart beating, your own ghost whispering. For 8 years, that silence was all Elliot Kane wanted. 8 years on a lonely patch of Arizona dust, with nothing but the sun for a clock and the stars for a roof. His ranch wasn't a home. It was a tombstone for the man he used to be. A marker for the mistake he made at a place called Wolf Pass, where a boy's life was traded for his hesitation. But tonight, the silence broke. It started low, a rhythm, wrong and out of place. It wasn't the scuttle of a lizard or the thump of a rabbit. It was heavier, desperate. The sound of boots stumbling over rock, of ragged breaths tearing at the dry air. The sound of a hunt. Kane moved to his porch, every line of his body tense. His hand didn't go for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Not yet. He just watched the dark. His eyes narrowed. He'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous things in the desert walked on 2 legs. And then he saw her. A shape pulling itself out of the deeper shadows. A silhouette staggering under a moon as white as bone. She moved like a wounded animal, one shoulder slumped, her steps uneven. But even from a distance, there was no surrender in her. Just a raw, stubborn will to keep moving forward. She was heading straight for his light, straight for him. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that she wasn't just bringing herself. She was bringing whatever was hunting her right to his doorstep. He should have doused the lamp. He should have melted back into the shadows of his own house and let the desert swallow her up. It was the smart play, the safe play. But he remembered the silence that followed the screams at Wolf Pass. He remembered what it felt like to do nothing. So he stood his ground. He waited. And with every stumbling step she took toward him, the heavy silence of his life shattered into a million pieces. The hunt was coming, and his 8 years of peace were officially over. She collapsed about 20 feet from his porch. Not a slow crumple, but a sudden, violent surrender of her body, as if a string had been cut. She hit the hard-packed dirt with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the vast emptiness. Kane was moving before he even thought about it, his long legs eating up the distance in seconds. He knelt beside her, the smell of sweat and blood and fear rising from her in a wave. Her dress, some kind of simple cotton thing, was torn at the shoulder, the fabric clinging to her skin. In the moonlight, he could see the dark, ugly stain spreading across the cloth. It wasn't just a tear. She was hurt, badly. Her hair was a wild tangle of black silk, fanned out against the pale dust. Her face, turned to the side, was all sharp angles and stubborn lines, even in unconsciousness. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Her skin was cool, but a strange energy seemed to hum just beneath it, an electric current that shot up his arm and made the hairs on his neck stand on end. His heart gave a hard, unfamiliar lurch in his chest. It had been a long, long time since he'd touched another human being. With a grunt, he slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, but her weight felt significant, heavy with secrets. He lifted her easily and carried her toward the cabin, every sense on high alert. He scanned the darkness, the jagged line of the mesas, the endless sea of rock and scrub. Nothing. No movement. No sound. But he knew they were out there. The silence now felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was watching. Inside, he laid her gently on his narrow cot. The single oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the room, making the familiar space feel strange and crowded. Her torn dress had shifted as he carried her, revealing the long, taut line of her thigh. It was the kind of sight that could stir a hunger in a man, a primal heat he'd spent 8 years trying to bury. He forced his gaze away, his jaw tight. This was not the time. This woman wasn't a stray lamb. She was a wolf, and trouble was snapping at her heels. He needed to see the wound. Gently, he took the torn fabric of her dress at the shoulder, intending to pull it aside. But as he did, his fingers brushed against something hard and sharp, buried deep in the muscle. His blood ran cold. He leaned closer, using the tip of his pocket knife to carefully cut away the blood-stiffened cloth. And then he saw it. It wasn't a splinter from a fall. It wasn't a wound from an animal claw. Lodged in her shoulder was a misshapen piece of lead, a bullet, and he recognized the caliber. It was Army issue, the kind of bullet fired from a standard issue 1873 Springfield rifle, the kind of rifle used by soldiers, and by the kind of man who led them. As if summoned by the thought, a low rumble started in the distance. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of hooves, many of them, pounding the earth, getting closer and closer. A steady, relentless beat that sounded like a death sentence. Kane straightened up, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside his window. He knew that sound. He knew the arrogance of that steady, unhurried pace. Silas Creed was coming, and he was coming to collect his property. The name hit Elliot Kane like a physical blow. Silas Creed, a ghost from a past he'd tried to outrun, a name synonymous with the blood and smoke of Wolf Pass. The man he'd reported, the man he'd ruined, the man who had sworn to see him dead. And now, that man was riding toward his front door. Kane moved with a sudden, deadly economy. He grabbed his rifle from beside the door, the worn stock feeling like a natural extension of his arm. He checked the load. He strode to the window, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. The plume of dust on the horizon was a dirty smear against the pre-dawn sky. He counted them. Half a dozen riders, moving with the easy confidence of predators who know they have their prey cornered. And at their head, a man who sat his horse like a king on a throne of bones. Creed. Kane's gut twisted into a knot of ice and fire. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a chance encounter in the vast, empty desert. This was a reckoning that had been 8 years in the making. His eyes flicked back to the woman on the cot. Neal, she'd later tell him her name was. She was stirring now, a low moan escaping her lips. Her brow was furrowed in pain, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was a mystery, a catalyst. But right now she was just a wounded woman in his bed, a woman with an army bullet in her shoulder. Creed's bullet. A question burned in his mind, hot and urgent. Was she running from Creed, or was she bait? Behind Creed's riders, Kane saw them. A miserable, trudging line of people roped together like cattle. Apache. Their faces were grim masks of dust and weary defiance, their eyes fixed on the unyielding ground in front of them. Prisoners. Creed was on a hunt, and he'd already had a successful night. The riders pulled up 20 yards from the cabin, the jingle of harnesses and the snorting of horses cutting through the morning stillness. Creed dismounted, his spurs kicking up little puffs of dust. He was just as Kane remembered, tall, arrogant, with a cruel twist to his lips and eyes as cold and dead as river stones. Creed's gaze swept over the small ranch, a venomous smirk spreading across his face. He wasn't looking for a fugitive. He was savoring a reunion. "Kane!" he boomed, his voice like gravel scraping on rock. "Still hiding in your hole? I figured the buzzards would have picked your bones clean by now, especially after Wolf Pass." The words were a blade, expertly slid between Kane's ribs, twisting into the old wound that had never healed. Kane's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. He didn't give Creed the satisfaction. Instead, he watched Creed's eyes and he saw them shift, flicking toward the cabin door. And in that instant, Kane knew. Creed didn't know for sure that she was here. He was tracking her, yes. But he was also hunting Kane, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, settling old scores. Kane stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door bang shut behind him. He didn't hold his rifle. He just rested his hands on the porch railing, a deceptively casual pose that didn't hide the coiled tension in his shoulders. "Creed," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You're a long way from your jurisdiction." Creed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My jurisdiction is wherever I say it is. I'm looking for a runaway, a thief, an Apache girl. Seen her?" His eyes bored into Kane's, trying to read him, to find a flicker of a lie. Kane kept his face a mask of stone. He was about to deny it, to send Creed on his way, when a soft sound from inside the cabin made his blood freeze. A floorboard creaked. Creed's smirk widened. It was a predatory, triumphant grin. He'd heard it too. "Seems you've got company, Kane," he drawled. Don't tell me you've gone and found yourself a stray. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his revolver. His men shifted in their saddles, their hands moving to their own weapons. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Cain didn't move. He couldn't, because standing in the shadowy doorway behind him, her figure framed by the dim light, was Neil. She was on her feet, swaying slightly, one hand pressed to her wounded shoulder. Her dark eyes, fierce and unyielding, were locked on Creed. And in them, Cain saw not fear, but a blazing, world-burning hatred. Creed's eyes devoured her. He looked from her defiant face to the curve of her hip, to the torn dress that did little to hide the shape of her body. A low, appreciative sound rumbled in his chest. Well, well, Creed purred, his voice dripping with ownership. Look what the cat dragged in. Come on out, girl. Your master's here to take you home. Neil didn't flinch. She just stood there, a pillar of defiance. But Cain could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the white-knuckled grip she had on the doorframe. Cain felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in 8 years, a primal, protective rage. It washed over the shame, the guilt, the solitude. He couldn't stand by. Not this time. He wouldn't watch another innocent life be consumed by this man's evil. She's not going anywhere with you, Creed, Cain said, his voice dangerously low. Creed's eyes snapped back to Cain, his amusement evaporating, replaced by pure venom. You want to die for this savage, Cain? After what happened at Wolf Pass, I'd have thought you'd learned your lesson about picking the wrong side. He unstrapped a canteen from his saddle and strode over to one of the Apache prisoners, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20. He yanked the boy forward by his hair, shoving him violently toward the horse trough. Thirsty boy, Creed growled, but his eyes were locked on Cain. He uncorked the canteen and poured the water onto the dusty ground, just inches from the prisoner's face. A deliberate, cruel act of dominance, a challenge. See what I can do? And you can't stop me. He was daring Cain to act, daring him to make a move that would justify the slaughter that was about to happen. Neil let out a small, choked gasp from the doorway. It was the sound that broke the spell. In a single, fluid motion, Cain moved. He wasn't a retired soldier anymore. He was a weapon. He kicked a nearby water bucket with all his force. It went flying, not at Creed, but at Creed's horse. The bucket crashed against the animal's flank with a loud clang. The horse screamed, rearing up on its hind legs, its front hooves lashing the air. Chaos erupted. Creed roared in surprise, stumbling back as he tried to control his panicked mount. His men cursed, their own horses spooked by the sudden violence. It was the only opening they were going to get. A split second of mayhem, and Neil seized it. She moved with a feral grace that stunned Cain. She wasn't a victim. She was a warrior. She snatched a jagged piece of rock from the ground, and in a single, slicing motion, she cut the ropes binding the young Apache prisoner Creed had been tormenting. Run! She hissed in a language Cain didn't understand. The young man scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted for the jagged rocks and canyons that bordered the ranch. Neil was right behind him. She moved like liquid fire, her hair whipping behind her as she darted into the unforgiving terrain, her bare feet seeming to find purchase where there was none. Cain watched her for a split second, his eyes drawn to the taut line of her back, the powerful flash of her legs under the torn dress. Then he snapped back to the present. Creed had finally wrestled his horse under control. His face was a mask of purple rage, his eyes promising murder. You'll pay for this, Cain, he bellowed, spurring his horse forward. You'll both pay. He and his men charged toward the canyons, firing their rifles blindly into the rocks. But it was too late. The canyons had swallowed Neil and the young prisoner like they were never there. They were shadows vanishing into a land of shadows. Creed pulled his horse up short at the edge of the rocky terrain, knowing it was useless to follow on horseback. He turned, his gaze fixing on Cain with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. This ranch is your coffin, Cain, he spat. Nowhere to run. Then he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men and the remaining prisoners trailing behind him. He wasn't retreating. He was regrouping. The dust settled. The sudden, violent noise was replaced once more by the heavy, watching silence. Cain stood alone on his porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just declared war on a man who burned villages for fun. His sanctuary was now a bullseye on a map. He looked toward the canyons where she had disappeared. He didn't even know her name, but he had just tied his fate to hers. The memory of her fiery eyes, her impossible grace, burned in his mind. She wasn't bait, she was the spark, and he had just thrown her into the dry tinder of his own life. The whole damn thing was about to go up in flames. The sun began to climb, baking the desert floor, but a cold dread settled deep in Cain's bones. Creed wasn't just a man, he was a force of nature, a plague that devoured everything in its path. And he wouldn't just be coming back for Neil, he would be coming back to finish what he started 8 years ago at Wolf Pass. Cain went back inside. The cabin felt different now, charged with the woman's presence. The scent of her, wild herbs and something uniquely her own, lingered in the air. On the cot where she had lain was a small dark smear of blood on his blanket, a reminder of her wound, a reminder that she was out there, hurt, hunted, and alone. He had to find her. It wasn't a choice. It was an imperative. He couldn't let Creed get to her first. He began to gather supplies, water, some dried meat, bandages, his knife. His movements were swift, precise. He was no longer the hermit, the ghost of Elliot Kane. He was falling back into old patterns, the muscle memory of a soldier preparing for a mission. As he packed a small canvas bag, his eyes fell on a small wooden chest tucked under his cot. He hadn't opened it in 8 years. He knelt, his fingers tracing the dusty lid. Inside was the man he used to be, the uniform, the medals, the letters from his wife Sarah, her faded handwriting a testament to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He hesitated, then opened the lid. On top of the folded uniform lay his old service revolver, a Colt Peacemaker. It was heavy, cold, and deadly. He'd sworn never to touch it again. It was a relic of a world defined by violence and death. But Creed had brought that world back to his doorstep. He picked up the revolver, its weight familiar and terrible in his hand. He strapped the gun belt around his waist. It felt like buckling himself into the past, chaining himself to the violence he had tried so hard to escape. He looked around the small cabin, his fortress of solitude. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. Creed knew where he was. He would be back, and he would bring hell with him. Cain and the woman, they couldn't stay here. They couldn't go back. Their only option was forward, deeper into the labyrinthine canyons where a man on foot could disappear. But as he stood there, a terrifying thought struck him. Neil hadn't just run into the canyons randomly. She had moved with purpose, with a familiarity that belied her desperation. It was as if she knew exactly where she was going. What if the canyons weren't just a place to hide? What if they were her destination all along? And what if his ranch, this isolated speck of land he'd chosen to forget the world, wasn't random either? What if it was a landmark, a waypoint on a map he couldn't see? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had thought he was a hermit, hiding from the world, but maybe all this time he'd been living on the edge of someone else's war, and it had finally spilled over. He stepped outside, the rising sun casting his long shadow behind him. He looked toward the canyons, a maze of red rock and deep shadow. He was going in, not just to find her, but to find answers. Who was this woman? And what secrets were hidden in the heart of the desert that were worth dying for? The trail wasn't hard to find, not at first. A smear of blood on a pale boulder, a scuffed boot print in a patch of sand, a broken twig on a creosote bush. She was moving fast, but she was wounded, and she was leaving a path for anyone with the eyes to see it. Cain moved with a hunter's silence, his boots making no sound on the rocky ground, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges and crevices above him. He knew Creed's men would be out there, fanning out, trying to cut her off. It was a race. He pushed himself harder, the sun beating down on his back. The canyons grew deeper, the walls rising up on either side of him, blotting out the sky. The air grew still and hot. It was like walking through an oven. Hours passed. His canteen was half empty, and the silence was absolute. He found her under a granite overhang, a shallow cave carved by centuries of wind and water. She was curled into a tight ball, her body shivering despite the oppressive heat. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. A fever had taken hold. He knelt beside her, his heart sinking. The bullet wound in her shoulder was inflamed, the skin around it an angry red. Infection was setting in. If he didn't get that bullet out and clean the wound properly, she would die. Easy now, he murmured, his voice a low rasp. He gently touched her forehead. She was burning up. Her eyes fluttered open. For a second they were wild with delirium and fear. She flinched away from his touch, a cornered animal ready to fight. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you, remember? From the ranch." Recognition slowly dawned in her eyes, chasing away the fever-bright panic. The tension in her body eased just slightly. She leaned back against the rock, her breath coming in ragged pants. Creed," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. "He's gone for now," Kane said. "But he'll be back. We need to move. And I need to take care of that shoulder." She nodded weakly, a flicker of that defiant fire returning to her gaze. He offered her his canteen, and she drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. He took out his knife. It wasn't a surgeon's tool, but it was razor sharp, and it would have to do. "This is going to hurt," he said, his voice flat. She looked him straight in the eye, her chin lifted. "Do it." He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He cut a strip from his own shirt and told her to bite down on it. Then, with a steady hand, he probed the wound with the tip of his knife. She cried out, her voice muffled by the cloth, her body arching in agony. He ignored it, focusing on the task, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. He could feel the jagged edges of the lead. He worked the tip of the knife around it carefully, trying not to do more damage. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling into his eyes. Her pain was a tangible thing in the small space, a current of electricity that seemed to flow directly into him. Finally, he felt the bullet loosen. With a final, deft movement, he prized it out. It fell to the sandy floor with a soft clink. Neil collapsed back against the rock, gasping, her body trembling with shock and relief. Kane didn't give her time to recover. He took a small flask of whiskey from his bag. "This will hurt more," he warned. He poured the alcohol directly into the open wound. She screamed this time, a raw, piercing sound that echoed off the canyon walls. It was a sound of pure agony, and it lanced through Kane like a hot poker. But it was necessary. The whiskey would clean the wound, fight the infection. It was her only chance. When it was over, she was limp, her face ashen. He quickly bandaged the wound with more strips of his shirt, his movements efficient and practiced. He had patched up enough men on the battlefield to know what he was doing. He sat back on his heels, his own body slick with sweat, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He looked at her, lying so still against the rock. And then he saw it. As he'd cleaned the wound, the blood and whiskey had washed away the grime from her shoulder. And now, clear as day in the dim light, he could see the mark he'd only glimpsed before. It wasn't a brand, not the kind burned into cattle or slaves. This was different. It was a tattoo, intricate, stunning lines of dark ink forming a complex symbol. It was a spiral, interwoven with shapes that looked like sprouting seeds and a soaring hawk. It was a work of art, and it pulsed with a meaning he couldn't comprehend. This was no ordinary Apache girl. This mark signified something important. It was a sign of status, of power, of a destiny he couldn't begin to imagine. As he stared at the symbol, mesmerized, her hand shot out and gripped his wrist. Her fingers were surprisingly strong, her grip like iron. Her eyes were open, and they were lucid. The fever had broken. The pain had sharpened her senses. "You saw it," she whispered, her voice raw but clear. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Kane could only nod, his throat suddenly dry. "It is the mark of the seed keeper," she said, her voice filled with a strange, ancient gravity. "It is my burden and my purpose." She reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the inside of her torn dress. She pulled out a small, deerskin pouch, its drawstring pulled tight. She held it out to him. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. "Creed does not hunt me," she said, her dark eyes burning into his. He hunts this. He thinks it is gold. He is a fool. It is far more valuable than that. Cain took the pouch. He loosened the drawstring and poured the contents into his palm. They were seeds, corn kernels, but like none he had ever seen. Some were the color of midnight, a deep, starless blue. Some were the color of fire, a blazing, angry red. Others were speckled white and black, like a starry sky. They felt warm to the touch, humming with a latent energy. "The last of our harvest," Neal whispered, a profound sadness in her voice. "Creed burned our village, slaughtered my people. He was looking for the Apache gold he'd heard stories about. He found our seed vaults instead. He thought they were worthless trinkets. But I managed to save one pouch, the last of the five sisters' corn, the seeds of our ancestors, the future of our people." Cain stared at the seeds in his hand, a sudden, staggering understanding dawning on him. This wasn't just about a runaway girl. This was about the survival of an entire culture, a legacy contained in a handful of colorful seeds. The weight of it settled on him, heavier than any rock. He looked from the seeds to the tattoo on her shoulder, and then to her fierce, determined eyes. He was no longer just helping a woman. He was now the guardian of a sacred trust. "There is a place," she said, her voice gaining strength, "a hidden valley, north of here. It is where these seeds are meant to be planted. It is where my people are waiting, the survivors." She pointed a trembling finger at the tattoo on her shoulder. "The mark is not just a symbol, it is a map." Cain's mind reeled. A map hidden in a tattoo. Sacred seeds. A secret valley. This was the stuff of legends, of old campfire stories. But the pain in her eyes, the weight of the seeds in his hand, the cold reality of Creed hunting them. This was real. "He can't have them, Elliot," she said, using his first name for the first time. It sounded strange and powerful on her lips. "If he gets these seeds, my people will starve. Our story will end. We will become ghosts." Cain thought of his own ghosts, the ones that whispered to him in the silence of his ranch. He had been a ghost for 8 years. He knew what that felt like. He carefully poured the seeds back into the pouch and handed it to her. He met her gaze, and a silent promise passed between them, a vow forged in blood and fire. "He won't get them," Cain said, his voice low and steady. "I won't let him." A sudden noise from above made them both freeze, the scrape of a boot on loose rock. They looked up. On the ridge of the canyon, silhouetted against the bright blue sky, was a man, one of Creed's soldiers. He had his rifle raised, pointed directly at them. He couldn't have missed. At that range, it was an impossible shot to miss. But the soldier didn't fire. He just stood there watching them. For a long, silent moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Cain pushed Neal deeper into the shadow of the overhang, shielding her with his own body, his hand moving to the Colt at his hip. The soldier on the ridge slowly lowered his rifle. He gave a short, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing from the ridge as silently as he had appeared. Cain and Neal stared at the empty space where he had been, their hearts pounding. What just happened? Was it a trick? Or had they just been shown mercy? "Who was that?" Cain whispered, his mind racing. Neal was staring at the ridge, a strange, thoughtful expression on her face. "His name is Corporal Jessup," she said softly. "He was there when my village burned. I saw his face. He did not want to be there. A man with a conscience, a crack in Creed's armor. It was a sliver of hope, but in their desperate situation, a sliver was enough. They couldn't stay there. The soldier might have let them go, but he would have to report their position. Creed would know where they were within the hour. They had to move, and they had to move now. "Can you walk?" Cain asked. Neal pushed herself up, her face tight with pain, but her eyes resolute. "I can." "Good," Cain said, "because from here on out, we don't stop." He helped her to her feet, his arm around her waist, taking some of her weight. She leaned against him, her body warm, her breathing steady in his ear. They moved out from under the overhang, deeper into the maze of the canyons. They were no longer just running. They were on a pilgrimage, and every step took them further away from the world they knew, and deeper into a legend that was very much alive. The canyons became their world, a labyrinth of red rock, scorching sun, and deep, cold shadows. They moved by day and rested for short, fitful hours by night, always listening, always watching. Kane's skills, honed by years in the army and sharpened by his solitude, kept them alive. He found hidden springs of water, identified edible plants, and navigated the treacherous terrain as if he'd been born to it. Neal, despite her wound, was impossibly strong. She never complained. She pushed through the pain with a quiet, stubborn grace that awed him. She was the one who knew the land in a deeper way. She pointed out ancient trail markers carved into the rocks, symbols invisible to Kane's untrained eye. She taught him the names of the spirits that lived in the rocks and the wind. She was a living library of a world he had only ever seen as a barren wasteland. During their brief rests, huddled by a smokeless fire made from dry mesquite, she told him more about her people, about the five sisters' corn, each color representing a different strength. Blue for wisdom, red for courage, white for spirit, black for the earth, and the speckled ones for the future, the coming together of all tribes. She spoke of Creed's raid not with hatred, but with a profound, aching sorrow. He was a man, she said, whose soul had been hollowed out, a walking void who could only destroy because he could no longer create. One night, as they shared a small piece of dried meat, she looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "Tell me about Wolf Pass," she said. The question caught him off guard. He stiffened. It was a door he had kept locked and barred for 8 years. "There's nothing to tell," he said, his voice tight. "A man does not hide in the desert for 8 years for nothing," she replied gently. "Your ghost is as loud as mine, Elliot Kane. Sometimes it is better to speak their names." He looked away, staring into the darkness. But her quiet patience was a tangible thing. It chipped away at his walls. And so, for the first time, he spoke of it. The words came out haltingly at first, then in a torrent, as if a dam had broken. He told her about the ambush, the chaos, the snow. He told her about Creed, a lieutenant then, giving an order to fire on a group of people waving a white flag, claiming they were a diversion. Kane had hesitated, had questioned the order. In that moment of hesitation, a young boy, no older than 15, had run from the group, a look of pure terror on his face. One of Creed's men, spooked, had fired. The boy fell. After that, all hell broke loose. It was a massacre. "Creed said I was a coward," Kane rasped, the old shame coiling in his gut. "That my hesitation got that boy killed. I reported him. They investigated. But it was his word against mine. They demoted him, but he was never truly punished. And I couldn't wear the uniform anymore. I couldn't be a part of a world where men like that gave orders." He finished, his throat raw. The silence that followed was deep, but it wasn't empty. Neal reached out and placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it anchored him. "You did not kill that boy, Elliot," she said softly. "Creed's order killed him. Creed's hate killed him. Your hesitation was not cowardice. It was your honor fighting back." Her words were a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and felt a profound shift inside him. For 8 years he had been defined by that single moment of failure. But she saw it differently. She saw honor. Suddenly a new terrible thought began to form in his mind. A piece of the puzzle that had never fit. "The boy," he said slowly. Creed always called him the boy, never by a name, but during the investigation. Creed told everyone the boy was his own nephew, that he was visiting the fort and had gotten lost. He used it to gain sympathy, to make my report seem like a personal attack from a jealous subordinate. "But he was not his nephew," Neal said. It wasn't a question. "No," Kane breathed, a horrifying realization dawning on him. "He was Apache. He was one of the ones waving the white flag, a peace envoy." The full monstrous truth of Wolf Pass crashed down on him. It wasn't just a mistake or a massacre. It was a calculated act of murder to sabotage a peace treaty. Creed had slaughtered them all to prevent peace from breaking out. And then he'd use the death of one of his victims as a shield to protect himself. And he had framed Cain, using Cain's own honor against him, to take the fall. The rage that filled Cain was cold and pure. It wasn't the hot, protective anger he'd felt at the ranch. This was different. This was the icy calm of a man who has finally seen the face of absolute evil and knows what he has to do. He was no longer just protecting Neil and her seeds. He was no longer just seeking redemption. He was going to hunt Creed down, and he was going to expose him for the monster he was, no matter the cost. This changed everything. They weren't just running to the hidden valley anymore. They were now on the offensive. Cain's mind, the sharp, strategic mind of a decorated soldier, began to work, formulating a plan. Creed would expect them to keep running, to keep hiding. He would never expect them to turn the tables. "The map," Cain said, his voice urgent. "The one on your shoulder. How does it work?" "It is read by the stars," Noel explained. "The Hawk constellation? When it rises over the three peaks to the north, its eye points the way to the valley's entrance. The lines of the tattoo align with the stars." "Creed won't know that," Cain mused. "He'll be tracking us on the ground. We can use that. We can lead him on a wild goose chase, double back, and buy ourselves time." And so began a deadly game of cat and mouse in the sprawling wilderness. Cain used every trick he knew. He laid false trails that led to dead-end box canyons. He used the wind to cover their scent. He backtracked over their own path, making it impossible to know which way they were headed. One afternoon, hiding in a high crevice, they watched Creed and his men pass below them, frustrated and angry, following a false trail Cain had spent all morning laying. They saw Creed strike one of his men in a fit of rage. His arrogance was making him sloppy, but they also saw something else. They saw Corporal Jessup, the soldier who had let them go. He was at the back of the patrol, and as they passed, he looked up, his eyes scanning the cliffs. For a heart-stopping second, his gaze seemed to lock directly onto their hiding place. Cain's hand went to his gun, but Jessup's expression was blank. He just stared for a moment, then turned and kept riding, disappearing with the rest of the patrol. "He saw us," Cain whispered. "Yes," Niall said, "and he did nothing." Their silent ally was still with them. It was a risk, but it was one they might have to take. Days turned into a week. They were running low on food. Niall's wound was healing, but she was still weak. Cain knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They needed a better plan. They needed a sanctuary. It was Neil who provided the answer. "There is a place nearby," she said one evening, studying the darkening sky. "An old mission, abandoned. The priest left long ago, but one man remains, an elder of my tribe who chose to stay. He is a wise man, a holy man. He lives between the worlds. He will help us." It was a risk. The mission would be a known landmark. Creed might think to look for them there, but they were out of options. They traveled for 2 more days, guided by Niall's knowledge. They found the mission tucked away in a small sheltered valley, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower silent against the sky. It looked deserted, a ghost of a building, but a thin tendril of smoke rose from a small dwelling behind the main chapel. They approached cautiously. An old man emerged from the dwelling. He was impossibly ancient, his face a road map of wrinkles, his white hair long and thin. He carried himself with a serene dignity. His eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. He looked at Neil, and a slow smile spread across his face. He spoke to her in their native tongue, a series of soft, guttural sounds. Neil replied, her voice filled with respect. The old man, whose name was Chaco, then turned his gaze to Cain. He looked him up and down, his eyes seeming to pierce right through to Cain's soul. "You carry a heavy ghost, soldier," Chaco said in perfect, unaccented English, "but your heart is true." Chaco led them inside, giving them food, fresh rabbit stew and cornbread, and clean water. He examined Niall's wound and applied a poultice of herbs that immediately seemed to soothe the inflammation. For the first time in weeks, they felt safe. That night, they told Chaco everything, about Creed, the seeds, Wolf Pass, the map and the tattoo. Chaco listened patiently, his eyes closed, nodding slowly. When they were finished, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he opened his eyes. They were filled with an ancient, sorrowful wisdom. Creed is more than a greedy man, Chaco said. He is a sickness, a blight upon the land. He does not just take, he poisons everything he touches. He is a symptom of a larger disease. Men in Washington, rich men with maps and deeds, who believe they can own the earth. He looked at Cain. You cannot simply run from this man. You cannot simply kill him. That would solve nothing. Another like him would just take his place. You must cut out the disease at its root. You must expose the sickness to the light. How? Cain asked. Chaco looked from Cain to Neol, then back again. A strange, knowing look passed over his face. There are many kinds of law in this land, he said. The white man's law, the people's law, and the law of the earth itself. Often they are in conflict, but sometimes they can be woven together. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There is an old treaty, a forgotten piece of paper from a time when your government still made promises to my people. It states that any land owned by a settler that is joined in formal marriage to a daughter of the people becomes protected sovereign land. It cannot be seized. Its inhabitants cannot be arrested by your army without the consent of the tribal council. It is a shield, a legal fortress. Cain stared at him, dumbfounded. Marriage? Yes, Chaco said, his eyes twinkling. He looked at Neol. She is a seed keeper, a daughter of the people in the highest sense. And you, he said to Cain, you are a landowner, your ranch. The implication hung in the air, stunning and audacious. A marriage, a fake marriage, a marriage of convenience, to create a legal loophole that could protect them both. It was insane. It was brilliant. Cain looked at Neol. Her face was unreadable in the firelight. The idea was preposterous. He was a broken man, a hermit hiding from the world. She was a sacred guardian of her people's future. They were from different universes. And yet, he thought of the way she leaned on him in the canyons, the trust in her eyes, the easy rhythm they had fallen into. A bond had been forged between them, a bond of shared survival and mutual respect. This crazy plan, it didn't feel as crazy as it should. If I am your wife, Neol said, her voice steady, her eyes locking with his, he cannot take me. He cannot set foot on your land. Under your own law, we would be untouchable. It was a desperate gambit, a shield made of paper and lies. But it was the only shield they had. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound. It sounded like a warning. Creed was still out there, and he was getting closer. Time was running out. It is a heavy vow, Chaco warned, his gaze fixed on Cain. Even a marriage of law has power. Words have power. You would be binding your fates together. Such things are not easily undone. Cain looked at Neol. The firelight danced in her eyes, tracing the defiant tilt of her chin, the soft curve of her neck. He saw the weight of her people's future resting on her shoulders, and he felt a fierce, undeniable urge to help her carry it. The ghosts of his past screamed at him to run, to retreat back into his solitude. But Neol's quiet strength called to a part of him he thought was long dead, the part that was a protector, the part that was still a man. He thought of the ring, his late wife's silver ring, tucked away in the wooden box under his bed, a symbol of a promise he had failed to keep. To use it now in a lie, it felt like a betrayal. But to not use it, to let Neol be captured and her legacy be extinguished, that felt like a far greater one. We have to go back to my ranch, Cain said, his voice firm. The decision was made. The deed to the land is there, and the ring. The journey back was even more perilous. Now they were not just evading, they were moving toward the heart of the danger zone. They traveled only at night, using the stars to guide them, sleeping in hidden caves during the day. The bond between them deepened with every shared danger, every silent look. Cain found himself watching her, noticing the small things. The way she would gently touch a flower, the fierce concentration on her face as she studied the stars, the quiet hum of a song she would sing under her breath when she thought he wasn't listening. They reached the outskirts of the ranch on the third night. From a high ridge, they looked down at the small cabin. It was dark. There were no signs of Creed or his men, but Cain knew better. It was a trap. "He's in there," Kane whispered, "waiting for us to walk in." "Or he has men watching," Neil added, her eyes scanning the surrounding rocks. "He knows you would have to come back for supplies." They needed to get into the cabin, to get the deed in the ring, without being seen. It was impossible. "There is another way in," Kane said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A secret I built for a day just like this." Years ago, when he first built the cabin, he had dug a root cellar, but he had also dug a narrow tunnel, branching off from the cellar, that led to a dried-up well about 100 yards from the house, hidden in a thicket of mesquite. It was his escape hatch. He'd never thought he'd actually have to use it. They waited until the darkest hour of the night, when the moon was hidden behind the clouds. They moved like shadows, silent and swift, to the old well. Kane removed the heavy wooden cover. The air that rose from the darkness below was cool and smelled of damp earth. "Wait here," he whispered to Neil. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, run. Head north. Don't look back." She grabbed his arm. "We do this together." There was no arguing with the look in her eyes. He nodded. He went first, climbing down the old rickety ladder into the darkness. She followed right behind him. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic. They crawled on their hands and knees, the sound of their own breathing loud in the confined space. Finally, they reached the trap door that led up into the root cellar. Kane pressed his ear against the wood. He could hear nothing. The silence was absolute. Too absolute. Slowly, carefully, he pushed the trap door open an inch. He peered into the darkness of the cellar. Empty. He pushed it open all the way and climbed out, his revolver in his hand. Neil was right behind him. They crept up the cellar stairs and into the main room of the cabin. The air was stale. A thick layer of dust covered everything. It seemed empty. Too empty. Kane moved toward his cot, his heart pounding. He knelt down and reached for the wooden box. His fingers brushed against the familiar wood. He pulled it out. And that's when he heard it. The soft click of a hammer being cocked. "Looking for this, Kine?" A voice drawled from the darkest corner of the room. A match scraped, and a lantern flared to life, flooding the room with a sickly yellow light. Silas Creed was sitting in Kane's own chair, his boots propped up on Kane's table. And in his hand, he held a single piece of paper. The deed to the ranch. Two of his men stepped out of the shadows, rifles leveled at Kane and Neil. "You've been a busy man, Kane," Creed sneered, a triumphant, cruel smile on his face. "But you're predictable. I knew you'd be back. This little piece of paper seems mighty important to you." He hadn't found the ring box yet. A small mercy. "It's over, Creed," Kane said, his voice steady, his revolver still held tight in his hand. Creed laughed. "It is, but not for me." He waved the deed. "I had a look at this. Peculiar wording. Says you own the land, the structures, and all mineral rights below. I've also been doing some digging of my own. Old survey maps. It seems your little paradise here sits right on top of the largest silver deposit in the entire territory. That's the real Apache gold, isn't it? Not some silly seeds." Kane and Neil exchanged a look of shock. Silver? Kane had had no idea. He'd bought the land cheap precisely because it was considered worthless. Creed had it all wrong, but his delusion was just as dangerous as the truth. "And now," Creed said, his smile turning venomous, "it's all mine." He stood up, tossing the deed onto the table. "Kill them. Burn the cabin. Make it look like an accident." The two soldiers raised their rifles. Time seemed to slow down. Kane knew they couldn't fight their way out. Two rifles against his one revolver. The odds were impossible. In that split second, Neil acted. She let out a piercingly loud, high-pitched shriek. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a signal, a hawk's cry. It startled Creed's men for a fraction of a second, but a fraction was all Kane needed. He dove for the table, upending it, sending the lantern crashing to the floor. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the spreading pool of burning oil. "Fire!" one of the men shouted in the dark. Kane fired his revolver toward the sound of the voice. A man grunted and fell. Neil, meanwhile, had scooped up the burning lantern's wick and flung it with perfect aim at the dry curtains. They went up in a whoosh of flame. Smoke and chaos filled the small cabin. "Get out!" Kane yelled, grabbing Neil's arm. They scrambled for the door as Creed roared in rage and confusion in the smoke-filled darkness. They burst out onto the porch and into the cool night air, just as the front of the cabin became fully engulfed in flames. But they weren't safe. Creed and his remaining man stumbled out after them, coughing, their faces black with soot. And then, from the darkness, came the thunder of hooves. Not 2 or 3 horses, a dozen. More. A line of Apache warriors, mounted on painted ponies, emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, their weapons raised. At their head was the young prisoner Neil had freed, and beside him, Corporal Jessup. Creed stopped dead, his face a mask of disbelief. "Traitor!" he shrieked at Jessup. Jessup just looked at him, his face hard. "The war is over, Creed. You just didn't get the message." The warriors surrounded Creed and his man, their bows drawn, their lances glinting in the light of the burning cabin. They were hopelessly, utterly outmatched. Creed, cornered and desperate, did the only thing a coward could do. He grabbed Neil, pulling her in front of him as a shield, pressing the barrel of his revolver to her temple. "Stay back," he screamed, "or the girl dies." Kane froze, his heart stopping in his chest. "Let her go, Creed," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Not a chance, Kane," Creed snarled, dragging Neil backward. "You cost me everything. Now I'll take what's most important to you." But Neil wasn't afraid. She looked at Kane, and in her eyes he saw not terror, but a message, a plan. She subtly shifted her weight, a tiny movement that only Kane would notice. It was the signal. Kane raised his own revolver, aiming it directly at Creed. It was an impossible shot. He could hit Neil. "You'll shoot her before you shoot me," Creed taunted. "No," Kane said. "I trust her." And with that, Neil dropped, her body going completely limp, falling straight down and away from Creed's grasp. For a single exposed second, Creed stood there, surprised, his gun aimed at empty air. It was all the time Kane needed. He fired. The shot echoed in the night, a single sharp crack that seemed to silence the world. Creed staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. A small dark hole had appeared in the center of his chest. He looked down at it, then back at Kane. He opened his mouth to say something, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. Then he fell, his body hitting the dirt with a final, heavy thud. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning cabin. The warriors let out a low, collective cry of victory. Kane rushed to Neil's side, helping her up. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I trusted you too." The cabin, his prison of solitude for 8 long years, burned behind them. It was a funeral pyre for the man he used to be. As he watched the flames lick the night sky, he felt not loss, but a profound sense of release. He was finally free. Jessup dismounted and walked over to Kane. "There's a ledger," he said, his voice low, "in Creed's saddlebag. Details of his whole operation, the silver mine claim, the names of the government men he was paying off, everything." Chaco's words came back to Kane. "You must cut out the disease at its root." This was it, the proof they needed to burn Creed's entire corrupt network to the ground. The young Apache leader, whose name was Kale, approached them. He gave Neil the deerskin pouch of seeds. She had dropped it in the chaos and he had recovered it. "The seed keeper is safe," Kyle said, bowing his head to her in respect. "And the people are in your debt, Elliot Kane." Kane looked at Neil, at the pouch of seeds in her hand, at the loyal warriors around them, at the burning remains of his past. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was on the right side of a war worth fighting. The Arizona dawn broke, soft and new, over the smoldering ruins of the cabin. They didn't linger. With the ledger secured and Creed's last man taken prisoner, they rode north. Kyle and his warriors escorted them, a guard of honor for their seed keeper. They traveled for 2 days, climbing higher into the mountains, until Kale brought them to a halt before a massive wall of sheer rock. It looked like a dead end. "The Eye of the Hawk," Neil whispered, pointing to a distinctive rock formation high above them that looked like a bird's head. Kyle chanted a few words in his language, and two of his warriors began to push against a section of the rock face that seemed no different from the rest. With a low grinding sound, a huge slab of rock swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. They had arrived at the entrance to the hidden valley. They walked their horses through the passage, which soon opened up into a place of impossible beauty. A valley, lush and green, cradled in the heart of the mountains. A clear river snaked through it, and a small, peaceful village of adobe dwellings sat nestled by its banks. This was the sanctuary her people had fought and died for. The survivors of Neol's village came out to greet them, their faces a mixture of sorrow and overwhelming joy at the sight of their returned seedkeeper. There in the center of the valley, under the watchful eyes of her people, they planted the seeds. Neol, with Chaco who had arrived ahead of them, led the ceremony, her voice ringing with the ancient songs of her ancestors. Cain stood beside her, no longer an outsider, but a welcome guest, a partner. In the weeks that followed, a new life began. Cain sent Jessup with the ledger to the nearest honest territorial marshal he knew. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Creed's network of corruption was exposed, and powerful men were disgraced. The ownership of the land containing the silver mine was thrown into chaos, but it was ultimately deeded back to the Apache, a small measure of justice in a world that had offered them so little. Cain stayed in the valley. He helped rebuild. He worked the land. He learned the language of the people, their stories, their songs. The ghosts of Wolf Pass grew quiet, replaced by the sounds of children laughing and the rhythm of a life with purpose. The bond between him and Neol grew, no longer forged in desperation and survival, but in shared respect and a deep, quiet love. The marriage of convenience they had planned never happened. It wasn't necessary. What they built together was more real and binding than any piece of paper. One evening, months later, they walked through the fields. The first stalks of the Five Sisters' corn were pushing through the rich earth, their leaves reaching for the sky. Neil stopped and took his hand. Her hand felt small and warm in his. "You are home, Elliot Kane," she said softly. He looked at her, at the love and strength shining in her eyes. He looked at the valley, his new home. He looked at the thriving corn, a symbol of a future they had planted together. And for the first time in his life, he felt the profound, unshakable truth of her words. He was home. This tale of fire and redemption is a reminder that even in the deepest silence, hope can grow, that one person's courage can change the world, and that the most valuable treasures are not buried in the ground, but are the ones we carry in our hearts. If you were moved by Cain and Neol's journey, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories like this coming, tales from the wild corners of the world where legends are born, and drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels, from our small corner of the desert to yours. Thanks for listening.